There's a reason ziggurats and pyramids look so similar, and it has nothing to do with aliens. Not because something descended from the sky with blueprints. Not because an advanced civilization jump-started human engineering. Not because the ancients needed outside help. The similarity isn't mystical, it's historical. And the trail is older than Egypt's stone. If you walk slowly through the cuneiform archives of ancient Mesopotamia, you find something quietly astonishing. Not one dramatic sentence that proves everything at once. Not a single tablet that shouts the answer. Instead, you find a pattern repeated and reinforced like a rhythm you can't ignore once you hear it. You find descriptions of divine beings. Anunnaki, who structure the cosmos in tears. You find temple hymns that praise stepped temple mountains as bonds between heaven and earth. You find creation stories where order rises upward out of chaos, where reality itself is described as layered, arranged vertical, and much of it is written 1,000 years before Egypt builds its first pyramid. So the connection isn't fantasy. It isn't speculation stacked on speculation. It's something more subtle, a shared religious language, a vocabulary of elevation, a way of thinking in vertical space authority above humanity, below transformation in between, that moves through the ancient Near East long before anyone quarried limestone at Giza. Once you see that you can't unsee it, and if you want to trace pyramid symbolism back to its true origins, you can gently support the channel, like subscribe only if you feel this kind of slow, long-form analysis is worth keeping alive. The visuals add depth, but they aren't essential. And if you're listening rather than watching, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Because you're about to follow an idea across 3,000 years. Let's begin. The pyramid form appears in Egypt with a strange kind of confidence, sudden, fully realized in symbolic purpose, as though the idea arrived complete. And in one sense, it did. Not through invasion, not through a master architect arriving from abroad, not through a classroom of instruction, but through inheritance, through the slow circulation of sacred concepts that travel without marching armies. Through a shared imagination that spans the ancient Near East, a grammar of sacred height. Night falls over the Giza Plateau. The last light stretches long, and the desert becomes a quiet stage. The limestone catches the setting sun and glows gold, then amber, then something dimmer and deeper as the day drains away. The pyramids rise with angles so clean they feel unreal against the softening sky. They stand in alignment in stillness, in a geometry that doesn't need explanation to feel heavy with meaning. Tour buses pull away, voices fade, wind takes over, and in the silence, something shifts. The monuments stop being achievements and return to what they have always been, expressions of an idea older than their stones, not tombs alone, not royal vanity alone, but diagrams of existence rendered in geometry, symbols before they were structures, myths before they were monuments. The Great Pyramid has stood for 4,500 years, but the meaning it embodies, the vertical cosmology, the sacred mountain, the bridge between mortal and divine, existed for millennia before the first block was placed. It existed in earlier temples, described in earlier texts, built into the religious imagination of civilizations that rose along rivers. And if we're honest, we've been taught a very clean story. The The pyramid is presented as an Egyptian innovation. It begins with Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara around 2630 BC, an architectural evolution from earlier rectangular mastabas designed by Imhotep. Then it develops quickly stepped terraces, become smooth-sided true pyramids perfected at Giza under Khufu around 2580 BC. In this story, the pyramid is a funerary monument, a royal tomb meant to secure the pharaoh's passage into the afterlife, constructed through the organizational genius of a unified kingdom. A story of kings, an eternity stone, and ambition. Textbooks frame it as an isolated evolution. Museums present Egyptian pyramid models beside Egyptian tools, Egyptian statuary, Egyptian inscriptions. Everything neat, everything self-contained. Egypt invents monumental sacred architecture, develops it, perfects it. And the pyramid becomes the defining symbol of their civilization. But the cuneiform tablets remember differently. The conventional story isn't wrong. It's incomplete. Yes, the Egyptians built the pyramids. Yes, they perfected the form. Yes, they encoded their theology into passages and chambers and shafts. Yes, they transformed the structure into the supreme expression of their cosmology. But they did not invent pyramid symbolism. They adapted it. They localized it. They gave architectural form to ideas that had been circulating through Near Eastern religious consciousness since the 4th millennium BC, ideas preserved in the oldest written texts humanity has produced. This recognition doesn't come from guessing. It rises from documentary evidence. Sumerian king lists, Akkadian creation epics, Babylonian temple hymns, and Egyptian pyramid texts, different scripts, different languages, and yet the same symbolic logic moving underneath. Consider what the cuneiform sources describe. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts dating to around 3000 BC, not as space travelers, not as extraterrestrials, but as divine authorities who decree fates and maintain order. They govern within a universe explicitly organized in vertical tiers. Authority descends from above. Hierarchy is spatial. Power has altitude. The cosmos itself is arranged like a pyramid of authority. And this isn't only philosophy, it becomes architecture. Ziggurat's stepped terrace temple mountains begin appearing in Mesopotamia by the late 4th millennium BC, more than 1,000 years before Egypt's first pyramid. They're mountain houses, dwelling places of the gods built specifically to link earth with heaven. Not tombs, not burial chambers. They do not contain the dead. Their purpose is ascent and communion. Their function is to embody a cosmology where the divine resides above and kingship mediates between realms. A cosmic diagram before it is a building. Now consider Egypt's pyramid texts inscribed inside 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids beginning around 2400 BC. They describe the deceased pharaoh ascending to the stars, joining the imperishable ones, the circumpolar constellations that never set. The pyramid is called a stairway, a ramp, a ladder reaching into the celestial realm. The king does not merely rest in the pyramid. He ascends through it. He transforms. Mortal becomes divine. Earth becomes sky. And suddenly the similarity between ziggurat and pyramid stops being about shape and becomes about meaning. Vertical space embodies sacred hierarchy. The monument enables transformation. Kingship bridges human and divine. Even the creation myths align in their direction. Egyptian cosmogony speaks of the primeval mound rising from the waters of chaos, the first solid point emerging upward into existence. The Ben stone symbolizes that emergence. The pyramid echoes it, order rising from chaos, frozen in geometry. Mesopotamian creation texts describe chaos being structured into a stratified cosmos, heaven above earth, below the deep beneath. Creation is not only an event, it's an arrangement. It becomes vertical. So, if pyramid symbolism emerges from Mesopotamian religious thought and spreads through cultural exchange across the ancient Near East, then the way we understand the pyramids changes. They are not isolated Egyptian inventions. They are local expressions of a transnational sacred vocabulary, shared ways of imagining divine authority, cosmic structure, and the human urge to reach toward meaning through stone. The pyramid does not mark Egypt's beginning. It marks Egypt's participation in a wider conversation about the architecture of meaning. A conversation that began when the first cities rose in Sumer, when the first priests described gods dwelling on mountains that touched the sky. The Anunnaki did not build pyramids. They defined the cosmic logic that made pyramids meaningful. They established the grammar of sacred space elevation hierarchy ascent. That grammar echoes through millennia, expressed differently in different cultures, but rooted in the same fundamental insight. Reaching upward is reaching toward order, toward authority, toward the divine. And the evidence does not live in one discipline. It is scattered. Assyriology, reading, cuneiform temple hymns, Egyptology, decoding pyramid texts, comparative religion, noting the structural parallels in myths, archaeology, dating ziggurats and mastabas, art history, tracing sacred mountains and royal legitimacy through iconography. Piece by piece, the fragments assemble into a coherent narrative, one that asks us to look past Egyptian exceptionalism and toward a deeper continuity of thought. Tonight, we begin that journey. We will trace pyramid symbolism backward, from Giza to Sumer, from stone to myth, from monument to meaning. We will examine the Anunnaki not as fringe figures, but as documented deities whose cosmic role shaped how humanity first understood vertical space as sacred space. And as we move forward, we'll keep circling back again and again to the same foundational question: where did the pyramid idea truly begin? Not the structure, but the symbol. Not the tomb, but the meaning. And the question, in a strange way, begins in silence, beneath the shadow of a monument that seems to stand outside time. Because once the last light fades at Giza and the desert becomes still, you begin to feel what this shape is really doing. And you begin to wonder whether Egypt built the pyramid, or whether the pyramid as an idea had been waiting for Egypt all along. So let's stay there at the base of the Great Pyramid and look carefully at the two narratives meeting in the dark, one written in stone and the other written in the older logic that made stone reach upward in the first place. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid as the last light fades and you're standing at the intersection of two stories. One story is obvious, documented, carved into history, Egyptian, dynastic, a narrative written in hieroglyphs and king lists confirmed by excavation, surrounded by dates and names and architectural diagrams. The other story is harder to point to because it's written in something more elusive. It's written in absence, in symbolic logic, in the way this shape already meant something before anyone in Egypt decided to build it. Because the pyramid exists not only because engineers could stack stone, but because the idea of stacking reality vertically had already taken hold in the ancient imagination. This is not a claim about who built what. Not a claim that Egypt didn't build pyramids. It did. This is a claim about meaning. about why this form among infinite possible forms becomes the chosen vessel for humanity's earliest expressions of cosmic order. And when you ask that slowly, patiently, the question doesn't stay in Egypt. It begins to drift eastward toward the oldest written testimony we possess. By the time Imhotep designs Djoser's step pyramid, around 2630 BC, Sumerian city-states have been literate for more than 500 years. Cuneiform writing emerges in Uruk around 3200 BC initially, for grain and livestock, yes, but quickly evolving to record something far more revealing than accounting: how the gods organized reality. And in those earliest religious texts, the universe is not flat. It is tiered. It is arranged. It is vertical. Heaven belongs to Anu, the sky god, distant and absolute. The middle realm, the atmosphere and the earth's surface, belongs to Enlil winds, decrees the domain where human affairs unfold. The deep below the freshwater abyss belongs to Enki wisdom craft, hidden knowledge. Between and beneath these realms move the Anunnaki, divine judges, administrators, the council through which cosmic order is maintained. This is not theological chaos. It is hierarchy rendered as religion. Authority flows downward. Power is positional. Rank is spatial. To ascend is to approach divine authority. To descend is to move toward the underworld, toward the forgotten and the dead. And a cosmology like that doesn't stay trapped in words. It demands architecture. So the first monumental architecture in Mesopotamia takes a form that mirrors the cosmos as they understand it, the ziggurat. Not pyramidal in the later Egyptian sense, different materials, different construction, but pyramidal in symbolic essence. A stepped mountain, a layered ascent, a structure that makes vertical theology walkable. The White Temple at Uruk, built atop a massive platform around 3200 BC, predates the first Egyptian pyramid by centuries. Its function is explicit: to create an artificial mountain where none exists naturally. To give the gods a dwelling place elevated above the mortal plane. To establish a physical connection between earth and sky. And here is where the question deepens. Why mountains? Across ancient cultures, mountains hold sacred status. Olympus in Greece, Kailash in Tibet, Sinai in the Levant, Fuji in Japan. Mountains are thresholds, boundary zones, where ordinary life thins out into something else, dangerous, liminal, holy. Gods dwell on peaks. Revelations occur at summits. To climb is to leave the ordinary world behind. But Mesopotamia had no mountains. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates is flat alluvial plain built from silt over millennia. And yet the mythology is filled with sacred mountains, cosmic peaks, where divine councils convene, where fates are decreed, where heaven and earth meet. So, the ziggurat becomes the answer to geographical absence. If the gods require mountains, humans will build them. If cosmic order demands vertical space, architecture will supply it. And now keep that in mind and turn back toward Egypt. Egypt has a different relationship with elevation. Cliffs and desert plateaus already exist. The Nile Valley is bordered by natural heights, and yet, when Egyptian kingship emerges and seeks to express its connection to the divine, It reaches for the same symbolic form Mesopotamia had already articulated: the sacred mountain, the staged ascent, the geometric embodiment of hierarchy. Djoser's step pyramid does not feel like an accident. It does not feel like trial and error. It feels like a translation, a concept rendered in local materials, adapted to local theology, but recognizable in its underlying purpose. And here we return again to the central question, not whether Egypt invented pyramids, but whether Egypt invented pyramid symbolism. The idea that a massive geometric structure rising toward the sky can serve as a vehicle for transformation, a bridge between realms, an instrument through which kingship participates in cosmic order. Chronology suggests otherwise. Theological parallels suggest otherwise. And the historical record trade diplomacy movement of craftsmen and ideas across routes connecting the Nile to the Levant and beyond suggests otherwise too. Symbols travel, ideas migrate, sacred vocabularies are borrowed, adapted, transformed. Egypt did not exist in isolation. The Nile Valley sits at a crossroads of African Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. To imagine pyramid symbolism arising in a vacuum, independent of the monumental sacred architecture flourishing in Sumer and Akkad, requires imagining an isolation that the region simply did not have. But notice what we're doing here. We're not arguing that a Mesopotamian architect arrived at Saqqara with a blueprint. We're not forcing a simple story. We're listening for a shared grammar. Because cultural exchange is rarely a single dramatic moment. More often, it is slow diffusion. A motif glimpsed on a traded object. A ritual concept overheard and reinterpreted. A prestige form that carries meaning and is absorbed into a new theological context. Egypt's early tomb architecture begins with the mastaba low rectangular earthbound. Its authority comes from mass, not height. Enduring visible, but horizontal. Then stacking begins, and stacking changes everything. The step pyramid rises in tiers, each level smaller than the one below, creating a terrace profile that ascends above the desert floor like an artificial mountain. Suddenly, the tomb is no longer only a container. It becomes a path, a climb, an upward statement. And the resemblance to a ziggurat is not just visual, it's conceptual. A stepped mountain built to mediate between worlds. Yet, Egypt adapts the idea in its own direction. Ziggurats are solid with a summit temple meant for divine descent, the god coming down to dwell above the city. Pyramids develop internal passages and chambers networks above and below ground, holding the king's body while enabling his transformation. Mesopotamia builds mountains for gods to descend. Egypt builds mountains for kings to ascend. Different movement, same logic. And this is where the modern confusion about the Anunnaki often enters, because the Anunnaki have become myth twice over. First in antiquity, then again in modernity. Contemporary speculation turns them into extraterrestrials, genetic engineers, ancient astronauts, manipulating DNA and building monuments. But strip away the modern overlay, and the Anunnaki are something more grounded and in a way more sophisticated divine bureaucrats. Judges, administrators, the council through which high gods govern reality. Cuneiform sources describe them across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts over nearly 2,000 years. Their function remains consistent. They decree, they judge, they assign cosmic roles. They are not creators. They are not architects. They are enforcers of cosmic law, intermediaries between supreme deities and the structured universe those deities establish. And to understand that role, you have to understand again, because we must keep returning to it, the vertical cosmology they inhabit. Heaven above, earth and atmosphere in the middle, the abyss below, authority descending in tiers, reality as stratified order. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk's victory over chaos results not only in a world being formed, but in stations being assigned, divine beings placed above and below, responsibilities distributed, the cosmos organized through delegation. This is governance. And governance in these texts is spatial. The phrase decreeing the fates appears again and again, not as random destiny, but as appointment, assignment, placement. Each being and thing must fulfill its role to maintain order. The Anunnaki deliberate when order is threatened. In flood traditions like Atrahasis, their decision emerges from a need to restore balance. So the universe functions through channels. Authority flows down. Supplication rises up. And a belief like that naturally seeks architecture that can enact it. Temple hymns describe sanctuaries as meeting points, places where heaven's authority touches earth. Ziggurats bear names that encode their purpose bonds between heaven and earth, foundations that anchor the two realms. And when later Egyptian texts describe the pyramid as stairway ladder ramp, when they insist the king ascends through the structure toward the imperishable stars, we are not seeing a separate invention so much as an inherited grammar spoken in a new accent. Again, not copied, not imported like cargo, but absorbed, adapted, made Egyptian. So we return because this script must return again and again to the same question: where did the pyramid begin? Not as stone, as idea, as symbol, as sacred grammar. And the deeper we listen, the more it seems the answer is not found at Giza first, but in clay tablets earlier, where heaven and earth were written as positions, not places, and where cosmic order was imagined as something that rises. And from here, the next step is to move even closer to that clay, into the specific language of ziggurat hymns, temple names, and ritual ascent, until the pyramid idea stops being a shape we recognize and becomes a structure of thought we can finally hear. If we want to understand why a pyramid shape feels inevitable, why it seems to appear with a kind of built-in meaning, we have to move closer to the oldest places where that meaning was spoken out loud, not spoken with stone, spoken with words, spoken with names. Because before the pyramid is a monument, it is a sentence. Before it is a skyline, it is a grammar. And the cuneiform record slowly, patiently keeps repeating the same claim in different forms, as if the scribes themselves knew that repetition is how sacred ideas survive. The textual evidence is not dramatic in the way modern audiences sometimes want. It does not announce, here is the origin of pyramid symbolism. It doesn't need to. Instead, it describes what these structures are, and what they do, and why their height matters. It describes ziggurats not merely as impressive buildings, but as functional cosmic architecture, operating mechanisms that maintain connection between separated realms. This is the key. Again and again, not representation. Operation, not metaphor. Function. In foundation inscriptions, in temple hymns, in ritual tablets, the language is direct. These structures link heaven and earth. They bind. They anchor. They make possible a kind of cosmic traffic offerings, rising authority, descending through vertical geometry. And the most revealing evidence is often the simplest, what the ziggurats are called, because names are not neutral in ancient religion. Names are theology condensed into a single phrase. Names tell you what a thing is for. And when you read the names given to these terrace mountains, you are reading an entire worldview in miniature. House of the foundation of heaven and earth. Bond of heaven and earth. Mountain house. The words keep circling. The same idea, heaven and earth, are not just places. They are realms, positions, zones in a vertical order, and something has to hold them in relation. Something has to anchor the system. Something has to be the point where separation becomes contact. So the structure becomes exactly that: a foundation, a bond, an axis. And notice how the script keeps returning to this, because ancient thought returns to it too. It does not hurry. It does not solve the question and move on. It restates. It reframes. It approaches from another angle, then circles back again. A temple hymn addresses the ziggurat in language that doesn't feel like casual poetry. It feels like definition: the house mountain, the lofty crown reaching heaven, grown together with the sky. The phrasing matters. Grown together, not merely pointed at the sky, not merely aspiring upward, but joined, made continuous. And then the hymn turns to authority, as these texts always do, because height and authority belong together in this worldview. It speaks of Enlil, the Lord, whose pronouncement is unchangeable, erecting the house, establishing its position, giving it a holy dais. Position. Again, holiness is positional. And if holiness is positional, then architecture becomes a way to move within holiness. To ascend physically is to approach purity. To climb is to approach the domain where decrees originate. This is why the ziggurat isn't just a city landmark. It is a cosmological machine. It creates layers you can stand on. It divides space into degrees of sacredness. It turns the invisible hierarchy of the cosmos into steps. And when later Egyptian texts call the pyramid a stairway or ladder, the echo is not accidental. It is the same intuition: height organizes sanctity, ascent organizes transformation, spoken in a different script. But stay here in Mesopotamia a little longer, because the ritual record brings the concept down from myth into procedure. It shows you the ziggurat not as a theory, but as a practiced instrument. Ritual texts describe the New Year festival at Babylon with a kind of methodical detail that doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. The king enters at dawn. He ascends. He is purified with water. He removes his royal insignia. He stands not as monarch, but as supplicant. The high priest strikes, his cheek pulls his ears, forces him to kneel. And the king speaks the negative confession. He has not sinned. He has not been negligent. He has not destroyed the city. This is not spectacle for its own sake. This is a renewal of cosmic order through humiliation and restoration performed at the summit, at the meeting point, at the place where heaven's authority can be accessed. And then after the confession, after the ritual stripping of power, the regalia is returned. Kingship is restored. Authority flows downward, but only after the king has climbed upward. Again, the same logic. Again, the same loop: ascent, submission, renewal. The ziggurat is where this loop becomes possible, because without the vertical structure, there is no summit to reach, no staged movement through holiness, no physical enactment of the idea that authority is above and must be approached. The structure provides the theater, but more than that, it provides the mechanism. It creates the condition in which ritual can become cosmic maintenance. And the people operating this system, priests, temple personnel, are organized in hierarchies too. Senior priests authorized for summit access, junior clergy remaining below. The structure doesn't just symbolize tiered reality, it trains a society to live inside tiered reality. Even the language itself fuses height and purity. The conceptual bond becomes grammatical. The idea becomes embedded so deeply that elevation and sanctity cannot be separated easily in thought. And here again, we return to the Anunnaki, not as modern fantasy figures, but as the divine administrators who make this vertical worldview coherent. Because if the cosmos is a tiered system, then it requires governance. It requires councils. It requires decrees. It requires beings who maintain the structure, assign roles, and ensure that boundaries hold. The Anunnaki are described as such beings, judges, administrators, decreers of fates. Not creators, not builders, not engineers. They don't construct monuments. They maintain the cosmic order that monuments are built to reflect. So, when ziggurats are named as bonds of heaven and earth, what you are seeing is not just architecture, but a political theology. The universe is a hierarchy. Authority resides above. The world functions through delegated power. And the meeting point between realms must be built, maintained, and approached through ritual discipline. This is why the question we keep asking slowly, repeatedly, keeps coming back in the same form. Where did the pyramid begin? Not as a stone technique, not as a structural solution, but as a meaning, as a sacred grammar. And here in Mesopotamia, the grammar is already mature. The ziggurat stands as proof that the concept of vertical architecture as cosmic bond is not an Egyptian invention. It is already articulated, already named, already practiced. Which means that when Egypt later builds its pyramids, it is not inventing the sacred logic from nothing. It is speaking a language already spoken, with different emphasis, with different theology, but with familiar grammar. And the deeper we go into the texts, the more the question sharpens, not into an accusation, not into a who copied whom, but into something calmer and more revealing. What happens when an idea becomes so powerful that multiple civilizations can adopt it without even realizing they've inherited it? Because if Mesopotamia's ziggurat is the bond where gods descend, then Egypt's pyramid becomes the ladder where kings ascend. And the pyramid texts will tell us again and again, in slow, ceremonial language, exactly how that ascent was imagined. The interior walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids, beginning with Unas, around 2375 BC, bear religious literature, carved in stone that was never meant for us, not meant for tourists, not meant for scholars, not meant for the living at all. These pyramid texts address the dead king directly. They guide him. They arm him with words. They speak to him as if speech itself is equipment, an instrument for crossing boundaries that cannot be crossed in silence. And what do they describe? Over and over, in different images, in different phrases, with ceremonial persistence, ascent. Not metaphorical rising, not vague spiritual uplift, but a literal vertical movement through a cosmos arranged in layers, a cosmos where authority resides above and transformation is achieved by climbing. The texts do not treat the pyramid as a place where the king simply lies. They treat it as a vehicle, a mechanism, a ladder made of stone and ritual speech. And this is where the loop tightens, because once you've read Mesopotamian temple hymns calling ziggurats bonds between heaven and earth, you begin to hear the Egyptian voice echoing the same structure of thought. Different imagery, yes. Different gods, yes. Different script. But the same underlying conviction: vertical geometry is not decoration. It is cosmic technology. Utterance after utterance insists that a stairway to the sky exists for the king. The pyramid becomes stairs, becomes ramp, becomes ladder, becomes ray of sunlight underfoot. The wording shifts, the imagery changes, but the direction stays constant. Upward, always upward. And in this repetition, you begin to feel the purpose of repetition itself. These spells were not written to entertain or to persuade. They were written to work. They were written as ritual machinery. They repeat because repetition stabilizes reality. They circle the same idea because the crossing is too important to risk with a single phrase. So the texts keep returning. A stairway is laid, a ramp exists, a ladder reaches, the sky opens, the king goes upward. And the destination is not a vague paradise. It is specific. It is located in the heavens. It is identified with the imperishable ones, the circumpolar stars that never set from Egypt's latitude stars that circle endlessly around the northern pole. To become imperishable is to escape the cycle, to escape setting disappearance death. It is to join a realm beyond the ordinary rhythms of mortality. So the king becomes a star. The king becomes luminous. The king becomes fixed in a higher order. And again, the structure is familiar. Mesopotamian cosmology is tiered. Egyptian afterlife theology is stellar. But both rely on the same principle. The sacred realm is above, and movement toward it requires vertical crossing. Even the pyramid itself is treated as an enabling device. The king's body remains below preserved, housed, anchored, but the purpose of preservation is not mere veneration of the corpse. It is maintenance of the physical link, while the king's transformed essence ascends. So the pyramid holds two realities at once: below body earth anchoring containment, above ascent transformation passage. And this duality is a kind of bridge again, that word we keep returning to because the monuments keep returning to it too. A bridge between earth and sky, between mortal and divine, between what remains and what moves. This is where Egyptian pyramids differ from Mesopotamian ziggurats in function, and yet share the same symbolic grammar. Ziggurats are solid with summit temples for divine presence. Pyramids contain internal passages and burial chambers, and their summit is not a public temple, but a geometric point, an apex that suggests the final convergence of ascent. But the shared logic remains sacred. Architecture operates on cosmic mechanics. It is not only a sign of transformation, it is the instrument through which transformation occurs. And the texts, if we listen slowly, say this in their own way. They list methods of ascent like a ritual catalog. Smoke, bird, insect, rays, floats. Each image suggests a path, a motion, a means. Each one is another attempt to keep the upward movement intact, to ensure the king reaches what he must reach. Because the pyramid is not only stone, it is also speech. Words are part of the mechanism, and the mechanism serves one purpose: to lift the king into the realm of the imperishable stars. If you've been taught to see pyramids as tombs and nothing more, this can feel like a reversal. A tomb is static. It is a container. It holds. It preserves. It prevents movement. But the pyramid texts treat the pyramid as dynamic, a device for crossing, a structure that enables motion from one cosmic tier to another. So we return again to the shared Near Eastern intuition. Authority resides above. Transformation requires ascent. The structure mediates. And what makes this especially striking is that Mesopotamian hymns and Egyptian pyramid texts are not merely similar in theme. They are similar in function. Both speak of vertical structures as bonds. Both treat ascent as ritualized access. Both place kingship within a cosmic hierarchy, whether administered by divine councils in Mesopotamia or navigated through stellar immortality in Egypt. Different details, same architecture of thought. And this is why the question must keep returning, because it isn't satisfied by a single conclusion. It demands contemplation, not efficiency. Did Egypt invent the pyramid as a symbol, or did Egypt inherit a symbolic system already present, already mature in the broader Near Eastern world? The pyramid appears in Egypt in stone, yes. But the sacred logic that makes stone rise into meaning is older than Egypt's stone, older than Saqqara, older than Unas, older than Khufu, older perhaps than Egypt's own written record. And when you place the pyramid texts next to Mesopotamian temple language, what becomes difficult to maintain is the idea that pyramid symbolism emerges in isolation. Because the pyramid texts do not sound like a culture inventing vertical sacred space from scratch. They sound like a culture speaking fluently in a language of elevation, as if the grammar is already known, as if the concept of the sacred mountain, the stairway, the bond between realms is already present in the broader imagination, and Egypt is now writing it in hieroglyphs, carving it in stone, directing it toward its own theological destination. So we circle back slowly once more to the foundational question: where did the pyramid begin, not the building? The symbol, not the masonry, the meaning. And perhaps the clearest answer is not a single location, but a timeline, a sequence in which Mesopotamia speaks the grammar first in clay and brick, and Egypt later speaks it in limestone and star-bound ritual speech. Because before any king can climb, before any stairway can be laid, there is an even deeper layer beneath both ziggurat and pyramid, the creation logic itself. The idea of emergence from watery chaos order rising upward, and both civilizations return to that origin again and again in their myths. Creation begins with emergence. That sentence sounds simple until you sit with it, until you let it slow down. Because in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, again and again, in different gods, different names, different imagery, the first act of existence is not a sideways expansion, not a spread across a surface, but an upward motion. Something rises, something breaks through, order appears as elevation. And if the first moment of reality is vertical, then the sacred form that reenacts reality will also be vertical. Not because geometry demands it, because meaning does. So, before we even talk about ziggurats as architecture or pyramids as monuments, we have to linger where both cultures begin in the waters. In Egyptian cosmogony before existence, there is only none. Infinite, dark, undifferentiated water. No sky, no earth, no boundary, no distinction. Chaos, not as violence, but as formless potential, everything possible and nothing defined. And then from that the first solid point appears. The Ben, the primeval mound rising from the waters of non-existence. And atop that first mound stands Atum, self-created speaking reality into being, bringing forth the first divine pair, Shu and Tefnut air, and moisture, and from them, the unfolding of the cosmos. Sky separated from earth, order extracted from chaos, boundaries established where none existed. And notice how the myth insists on direction. The first act is upward. Solid ground rises. The world begins by lifting itself out of the abyss. The Ben stone, kept in the temple at Heliopolis, commemorates that moment. It is sacred not simply because it is ancient, not simply because it is housed in a holy place, but because its form encodes the event itself, emergence elevation, the first point. And when later pyramids echo the Ben's shape, pyramidal tapering upward, they are not merely inspired by the creation story. They are attempting to repeat it. They are turning cosmogony into architecture. They are freezing the first moment of existence into stone. So every pyramid becomes, in a sense, an act of creation reenacted. Order rising from chaos. Reality rising from the waters. A king's transformation embedded inside the same motion that brought the universe into being. But now turn slowly to Mesopotamia. Because Mesopotamian creation mythology follows parallel logic through different names. Again, different imagery, but the same structure of thought, the same gravitational pull toward vertical arrangement. In the Enuma Elish chaos is personified in the mingling of waters, Tiamat saltwater chaos, and Absu freshwater abyss. Before creation, they are undifferentiated mixture, no separation, no structure, no fixed order. And then order comes through division. Marduk defeats Tiamat and uses her body to establish boundaries. Half becomes heaven, half becomes earth. The cosmos becomes structured, layered, heaven above, earth below, the deep beneath. Creation is not only making things, it is placing things. It is assigning positions. It is establishing vertical stratification. And at the center of this organized reality stands the cosmic mountain, the axis where heaven and earth meet the anchor around which the cosmos holds together. In Sumerian thought, that mountain appears under the term Kur, a word that can mean mountain, and also foreign land, the edge of the known world. It is the threshold between realms. It is where the divine council convenes. It is where distances are measured from. It is the pivot point. And here the irony becomes almost poetic. Mesopotamia geographically possesses no mountains in the land between the rivers, and yet myth insists on mountains, on peaks, on sacred heights. So the mountain is not geology. It is theology rendered as landscape. It is the intuition that the world structure is vertical and that where the worlds touch, where heaven and earth interface must be imagined as height. So, if the myth needs a mountain and the land does not provide one, humans will build one. That's the deeper logic underneath the ziggurat. And now notice the loop once again. We're back where we started, not with architecture as invention, but with meaning as inheritance. Myths are not decorative stories in these cultures. They are blueprints. They describe how reality is structured, and therefore how sacred space must be structured if it is going to work. So, when you see a ziggurat, you are not seeing a random aesthetic choice. You are seeing creation logic translated into brick. And when you see a pyramid, you are not simply seeing a tomb. You are seeing creation logic translated into stone, Egypt's version of emergence, Egypt's version of the primeval mound scaled up and made permanent. This is why the pyramid form can feel so final, so complete, so inevitable. Not because it is the only way to build high, but because it is the only way within this worldview to build high with meaning. And this is also where comparative mythology enters, not to introduce something foreign, but to name what's already present in the material. The pattern is often called the axis mundi, the world axis, the cosmic center, the vertical channel that connects realms. It appears in different civilizations with different images. Yggdrasil, the world tree; Mount Meru, the world tree in Siberian shamanism; Jacob's ladder, different names, same shape of thought; heaven above, underworld below, the human realm in between. And the axis always vertical functions as the channel through which divine authority descends and human supplication rises. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat becomes the literalization of that axis. In Egypt, the pyramid becomes the vehicle for crossing it. But the axis itself exists first as a concept, first as myth, first as the deep intuition that the cosmos is stacked, layered, hierarchical. So when we ask again, because we must ask again from another angle, where the pyramid idea begins, we are not asking where stone construction begins. We are asking where this vertical imagination begins, where the conviction begins that order rises, that authority resides above that transformation, is achieved by moving upward. And here the answer keeps pointing backward into the oldest testimony we have cuneiform and early myth, the written record of a cosmos organized into tiers and maintained by divine administrators. The pyramid does not emerge as pure engineering. It emerges as cosmology made visible, as creation reenacted, as a sacred mountain built where the first mountain was myth. And if that's true, if the pyramid is creation logic frozen into geometry, then the form was waiting in the myths long before it was raised in stone. Transition into part 6, which means the next question is not only what do the texts say, but what do the earliest images show? The seals, the reliefs, the symbolic art that proves the idea existed before monumental architecture fully arrived when the shape carried meaning before it carried weight. There's a quiet kind of proof that lives in images, not the kind of proof that arrives with a single inscription saying this is the origin, not the kind that settles debate in one stroke, but the kind that accumulates small confirmations, repeated motifs, early visual echoes of the same vertical logic. Because if pyramid symbolism is older than pyramids, then we should expect to find the symbolism before we find the fully developed monument. And we do. Early symbolic art confirms this priority. Cylinder seals from the Uruk period, 3500 to 3100 BC, depict stylized mountains with divine figures at their summits. Not because artists are predicting ziggurats, because the mountain is already a sacred idea, a cosmic threshold already imagined in vertical form. Reed bundles arranged in doorway shapes represent temple entrances, yes, but also cosmic thresholds, places where one realm becomes another, where the ordinary opens into the sacred. And again, the motif is not flat. It's not merely a boundary line. It's an opening that suggests passage. Stepped platforms appear in miniature, carved into amulets, stamped into seals, showing that the idea of stage descent layered height had meaning even before the skyline was dominated by massive terrace mountains. The form is rehearsed in small. It is repeated. It is learned. It becomes familiar. And then later, it becomes monumental. Egyptian pre-dynastic art shows similar preoccupations. Palettes and ceremonial objects depict kings elevated above enemies. Mace heads show rulers on platforms. Again, height as authority, elevation as legitimacy, vertical position as power. So the symbolism is there early. Before the pyramid defines the landscape, the shape carries meaning before carrying weight. Pyramid symbolism is mythological before it is architectural. And this matters because it tells us something about how these monuments come into being. They are not simply technical achievements that later receive symbolic interpretation. They are symbolic achievements that demand technical realization. Geometry does not invent the meaning. Geometry expresses it. So, when the White Temple at Uruk rises above the Mesopotamian plain, built atop a massive platform around 3200 BC, it represents something more than early monumental building. It represents humanity's first large-scale attempt to impose vertical geometry onto horizontal geography, to create what nature did not provide, to build the mythological mountain into physical accessibility. It rises about 40 feet above the plain, visible across the flatland, a constructed height meant to change how the world is experienced, to announce that here, at this point, Earth is no longer only Earth. Here it becomes the meeting place where heaven's authority can be approached. And notice what the structure is doing. Even in this early form, it's not only up, it's also separation. The sacred is removed from the ordinary by elevation. It becomes harder to reach, not because the gods are cruel, but because holiness is positional. You climb into it. This is the logic that matures into the ziggurat. By the end of the 4th millennium, BC terrace mountains dominate the skylines of Mesopotamian cities. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur. Each major urban center constructs its sacred mountain dedicated to the patron deity rising in stages toward the sky. Construction follows consistent principles, a solid mud brick core sometimes reinforced with reed matting to prevent cracking, fired brick facing often glazed, bitumen mortar ceiling joints against weather. In a landscape where so much is vulnerable to erosion, where houses and walls are temporary, compared to the slow violence of seasons, these structures aim for permanence. They endure because they are meant to. They anchor the city cosmologically. They become the stable point around which communal life organizes itself. To live in a Mesopotamian city is to live in the shadow of the sacred mountain, to orient daily existence around the vertical axis connecting mortal and divine. And when we reach the mature ziggurat form like the Great Ziggurat at Ur, constructed under King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, the choreography of ascent becomes deliberate. Massive terraces rise in succession. Monumental staircases converge toward the first level. The approach itself becomes ritualized movement. Only priests ascend fully. Only kings in specific ceremonies. At the summit is a small temple chamber where the god is believed to descend and dwell. And again, the interior is not a burial space. No tomb, no funerary equipment. The structure is solid mass, built not to contain the dead, but to stage the meeting point between realms. So the ziggurat is a mountain for divine habitation. Now hold that and let the loop continue forward in time. Because when we reach Babylon and the great Anunnaki, built and rebuilt over centuries, reaching its final form under Nebuchadnezzar II, around 600 BC, we see the idea stretched to its ultimate expression. 7 distinct stages dominating the horizon, named in a way that almost functions as a theological thesis. House of the foundation of heaven and earth. Not merely reaching toward heaven, but grounding the connection foundation bond anchor point. The structure asserts that heaven and earth are not independent. They are held in relation. They require a hinge. And in inscriptions, the verb repeats raised, lifted, elevated, because elevation is the act. Elevation is the meaning. Ritual texts describe festivals where kings ascend and perform ceremonies that renew cosmic order through communion at the axis point. Again, the architecture enables the ritual. The height makes the communion possible. The form is function. And this is why when Egypt later builds pyramids, when internal passages guide the pharaoh's ascent, when pyramid texts call the monument a stairway to the sky, the resemblance to Mesopotamian logic is not superficial. It is structural. But we must keep repeating the caution because the modern mind wants shortcuts. This is not a claim that Egypt copied a blueprint. It's a claim that Egypt inherited a sacred grammar already established, already rehearsed in small images, already monumentalized in brick, already reinforced by ritual practice. And so the question returns again, because it refuses to be answered only once. Did Egypt invent pyramids? Yes, as Egyptian monuments. But did Egypt invent pyramid symbolism? The idea that vertical geometry is the correct language for cosmic hierarchy and divine contact? Or did that symbolism exist earlier, already articulated in Mesopotamian myth, named in temple titles, enacted in ziggurat ascent? This is why the story doesn't end at Giza. It begins to stretch backward into clay, into hymn, into image, into the first time a human community looked at a flat horizon and decided that the sacred must rise. And from here, we need to move back toward Egypt again, not away from Mesopotamia, but carrying Mesopotamia with us so we can watch the mastaba become the step pyramid, and the step pyramid become the smooth-sided form, and ask slowly whether what looks like architectural evolution is also symbolic translation. When Egypt enters the story, it doesn't enter as a blank page. It enters as a civilization already surrounded by older conversations, older experiments in sacred height, older habits of thinking about authority as something that lives above and flows downward. And the closer you look at Egypt's earliest monumental forms, the more you feel that what we call architectural evolution is also something else. A translation, a local rendering, a way of speaking a shared language with Egyptian materials. Because Egypt's early tomb architecture begins low. It begins horizontal. It begins with the mastaba rectangular solid earthbound, a durable shape, a visible marker, a place to hold the dead and their funerary goods. The mastaba is permanence, but it is grounded permanence. It hugs the desert floor. Its power comes from mass, not height. And that matters because when we ask where pyramid symbolism begins, we are not only asking when someone learns to stack stone, we are asking when a culture decides that height, specifically height, is the proper medium for sacred meaning. The mastaba is not yet that decision. It is stable, but it is not ascending. It is a marker, but it is not a ladder. So when Djoser's architect transforms the mastaba by introducing stacking, something changes that feels almost immediate, almost unmistakable. The step pyramid at Saqqara rises in distinct tiers, 6 levels each, smaller than the one below. The profile becomes a staged ascent. The tomb becomes an artificial mountain. The necropolis becomes a skyline. And again, we return to the sensation. It does not look accidental. It does not feel like a slow, uncertain groping toward a final form. It feels like the moment a symbolic grammar finds its physical voice. Because the step pyramid is in essence a ziggurat-shaped claim made in limestone. And yes, the cultures are different. The materials differ. The rituals differ. The theology differs. But the shared logic is hard to ignore. Stepped construction, receding stages, vertical movement implied by the structure itself. The form says climb. The form says above is different. The form says height is not merely impressive, it is sacred. And if you place this beside the Mesopotamian record, centuries of ziggurat building, already established, by the time Saqqara rises, the timing begins to press on the question again. Not as accusation, as pressure. Because Mesopotamia has already spent hundreds of years building sacred mountains of mud brick, already naming them bonds of heaven and earth foundations, where the realms meet, already ritualizing ascent and summit access as the choreography of divine contact. So, what exactly is Egypt doing when it suddenly stacks tomb architecture into a terrace mountain? Is it inventing the symbolic meaning of ascent, or is it stepping into a pre-existing symbolic system and adapting it to Egyptian kingship? And the script keeps insisting we take the second possibility seriously, because the ancient Near East is not a map of isolated worlds. It is a web. Trade routes connect Egypt to the Levant and beyond. Materials move cedar from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Sinai. Goods travel and ideas travel with them, not always consciously, not always in neat packets, but through the slow intimacy of contact. Craftsmen observe foreign techniques. Merchants witness foreign rituals. Diplomatic exchanges create awareness of prestige forms. Iconography migrates. Symbolic motifs shift across borders. Egyptian cylinder seals from the First Dynasty show Mesopotamian influence in style and motif. Early dynastic art incorporates patterns recognizable from Sumerian visual culture. And later diplomatic correspondence makes clear that contact between courts in the region was not unusual. It was part of the broader reality of interconnection. So, again, we return to the same point in the loop. To imagine that Egyptian pyramid symbolism arose in a vacuum requires imagining an isolation that did not exist. But it's equally important to return because the conversation must circle to the other side. Egypt is not simply copying. Egypt is not importing ziggurats. Egypt is doing something distinctly Egyptian with a shared grammar. Because the differences are real. Ziggurats are primarily solid. Their purpose is summit access for ritual communion. Their interior mass supports the height. Their function is enacted on the exterior steps and at the top chamber where the deity is believed to descend and dwell. Djoser's complex, by contrast, introduces a different emphasis. The step pyramid contains internal passages and spaces burial chambers carved into bedrock beneath the superstructure networks that extend both above and below ground. The monument's function is tied to funerary transformation. The king's body is preserved, anchored, held. And yet the structure also implies a path, an ascent that is spiritual as much as physical. So the direction of movement changes. Mesopotamia builds mountains for gods to descend. Egypt builds mountains for kings to ascend. The structure mediates in both cases, but the theological traffic changes direction. And this difference is crucial because it prevents the story from collapsing into something simplistic. The question is not who invented the shape. The question is, where did the meaning of the shape come from? Where did the conviction come from that vertical geometry is the correct language for sacred hierarchy? And this is why the step pyramid can be read as both innovation and inheritance at the same time. Innovative in material and internal complexity. Inherited in symbolic grammar. A translation, not a duplicate. A local accent, not a foreign script. Because once Egypt begins stacking, the evolution accelerates. The step pyramid becomes a template. The stepped form becomes the proof of concept. And quickly, the stepped terraces give way through further development to the smooth-sided true pyramids culminating at Giza under Khufu around 2580 BC. Here again, the form seems to arrive with purpose already intact. And that returns us to where the narrative began. The pyramid appears in Egypt, suddenly fully realized in symbolic purpose, as though the idea itself arrived complete. And perhaps it did because the idea had already been articulated elsewhere in the region, circulating as sacred vocabulary long before Egypt perfected it in stone. But we must be careful. We must keep repeating the caution, because the mind wants a single clean line of transmission. This is not an argument for direct instruction, not for invasion, not for Mesopotamian architects teaching Egyptians how to build. It is an argument for shared religious language, a vocabulary of elevation that spans the ancient Near East, a way of thinking in tiers, a way of treating height as holiness, ascent, as transformation, the mountain, as the axis where realms meet. That language can be inherited without conscious borrowing. It can be absorbed the way metaphors are absorbed, becoming so natural that they feel native. And perhaps that is why Egypt's Pyramid Age can feel so self-contained in museum narratives, because once Egypt adopts the grammar, it speaks it so fluently that it looks like invention. So we return again from another angle to the central question. Did Egypt invent the pyramid as a monument? Yes. Did Egypt invent the pyramid as a symbol, vertical geometry as cosmic mechanism? The evidence keeps leaning backward toward Mesopotamia's older inscriptions and older mountains built from brick. And this is why the pyramid's meaning feels older than its stones. Because it is older than its stones. Because the cosmic logic authority above transformation through ascent kingship as bridge was already part of the Near Eastern imagination when Egypt began raising limestone mountains along the Nile. And now with Egypt's translation in view, we can listen more closely to how the shared vocabulary itself speaks, how phrases like bond, foundation, stairway, ladder, and ascent repeat across scripts, across centuries, across cultures until the pyramid stops being an Egyptian object alone and becomes a Near Eastern sentence spoken in different alphabets. If the pyramid is a sentence, then its meaning lives in how often that sentence gets repeated. Not repeated word for word, repeated in structure, repeated in rhythm, repeated in the way civilizations keep circling the same idea and refusing to let it go, that height is not neutral, that vertical space is not just geometry, that going upward is not merely movement, it is transformation. So listen to the vocabulary. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurat is named as a bond between heaven and earth. It is described as a foundation where the realms meet. It is praised as a house mountain reaching upward, grown together with the sky. In Egypt, the pyramid is called a stairway, a ladder, a ramp reaching toward the celestial realm. The king ascends through it, as if the monument itself is a device for vertical crossing. Different words, same grammar. And the more you hear that grammar repeat, the harder it becomes to treat it as coincidence or parallel invention alone, at least within the Near Eastern context, where contact and exchange are historically real. Because exchange is not only about goods, it's about metaphors, it's about sacred solutions, it's about the way one civilization's way of imagining reality can become another civilization's tool for imagining kingship. So we return again to the Anunnaki, not because we want to sensationalize them, but because they sit at the center of Mesopotamia's vertical worldview. They are the divine council within a cosmos arranged in tiers. They decree fates, meaning they assign roles, positions, functions. They maintain cosmic order as something spatial, something hierarchical, something arranged above and below. This matters because it shows that the sacred grammar is not architectural first, it is theological first. Architecture follows theology. If reality is a hierarchy, then sacred space must embody hierarchy. If authority resides above, then the place where authority is approached must rise. If transformation is movement between tiers, then sacred architecture must make tier crossing possible. The ziggurat does this by elevating a summit where the god may descend. The pyramid does this by elevating a structure through which the king may ascend. So when Egyptian pyramid texts describe the king joining the imperishable stars, becoming one of the ones that never set the imagery, is different from Mesopotamia's Council of Gods, but the structure is familiar. The highest realm is stable, eternal, authoritative. To reach it is to escape the cycles of mortal existence. To enter it is to become something other than human. And again, notice how the language refuses to be efficient. It repeats. It offers multiple metaphors for ascent. It keeps returning to the upward direction because the crossing is too important to say only once. A stairway is laid, a ladder exists, a ramp is underfoot. The king rises, he goes up, he reaches the sky. This is ritual logic, redundancy is strength. And Mesopotamian ritual logic is the same. The king ascends the ziggurat at dawn. He is purified, he is stripped of regalia. He kneels, he confesses, he is struck, he is restored. He receives kingship anew from above. The loop is the point. Ascent, submission, renewal. Ascent, submission, renewal. So what we are seeing across cultures is not simply tall buildings. We are seeing a repeated sacred loop enacted in architecture, a loop in which height grants access, access requires humility, humility renews authority. And this is why the pyramid cannot be reduced to tomb function alone. Because tomb function explains containment, it explains preservation, it explains burial goods and chambers and seals. But it does not explain why the monument must be a mountain. It does not explain why the monument must be an ascent. It does not explain why vertical geometry becomes the chosen vessel for kingship's cosmic claim. That explanation lives in the shared grammar vertical cosmology. So we return again to creation logic, because that is where the grammar is born. Both cultures imagine existence emerging upward out of watery chaos. Both imagine order as something that rises, that separates, that establishes tiers. Both imagine the first point of reality as a mound, a mountain, an axis, a place where the worlds touch. Egypt calls it the primeval mound, the Benben, rising from Nun. Mesopotamia describes cosmic organization as stratification heaven above earth, below the deep beneath, established through separation from undifferentiated waters. Different stories, same structure. And because the structure is the same, the architecture that reenacts the structure becomes recognizable across cultures, even when it is not identical in material. The ziggurat is mud brick and staged terraces. The pyramid becomes limestone and smooth geometry. But both speak the same sentence: order is vertical. Which brings us back to the question we keep refusing to leave behind. Where did the pyramid begin, not as stone engineering, as sacred grammar, as a way of thinking? And here is the uncomfortable but compelling possibility: Egypt's pyramid symbolism is not a self-generated invention. It is a localized expression of a sacred vocabulary already circulating through the Near Eastern religious consciousness. This does not diminish Egypt. If anything, it places Egypt within a wider and more complex story, one in which civilizations build meaning together across borders and centuries, often without realizing how much they share. Because Egypt does something extraordinary, it takes the shared grammar and perfects its architectural expression. It moves from mastaba to step pyramid to true pyramid with stunning speed. It encodes ascent into internal passages, aligns shafts with stars, inscribes ritual speech into stone, and turns the monument into a cosmic device for royal transformation. So Egypt is not merely adopting, it is intensifying, it is crystallizing, it is making the grammar unavoidable. And this is why when we stand at Giza at night, the pyramids feel like they dominate not only the horizon, but the imagination itself. They are the grammar made monumental. They make the vertical worldview visible from miles away. And yet the grammar is older than the limestone. The grammar is in clay tablets earlier. The grammar is in ziggurat names. The grammar is in hymns that call a temple mountain the bond of heaven and earth. So the pyramid does not mark Egypt's beginning. It marks Egypt's participation in a wider conversation about the architecture of meaning. A conversation that began when the first cities rose in Sumer, when the first priests learned to write heaven and earth and understood them not only as places, but as positions in a hierarchy. And if we let that sink in, the pyramid becomes less a national invention and more a regional statement, a Near Eastern answer to universal questions. How does authority manifest spatially? How does the human approach the divine? How does architecture embody cosmology? Mesopotamia answers first with ziggurats, mountains for gods to descend. Egypt answers later with pyramids, mountains for kings to ascend. Different answers, same language. And once we accept that the pyramid is a grammar that can travel, we have to face the next loop in the story. The one that widens the frame beyond the Near East entirely, because the pyramid appears again elsewhere, without contact. And the recurrence forces us to ask whether transmission explains everything, or whether vertical geometry speaks to something deeper in the human instinct to reach upward. At a certain point, the story stops being only about Mesopotamia and Egypt, not because we leave them behind, but because the question they raise refuses to stay contained inside one region. Because the pyramid, this shape, this logic, this instinct appears again. And when it appears again, far from the Nile and the Tigris, without contact with the old world, the meaning of the recurrence becomes part of the argument. The pyramid appears in Mesoamerica without connection to Egypt or Mesopotamia. Temple pyramids rise at Teotihuacan, at Chichen Itza, stepped platforms supporting shrines oriented to celestial phenomena serving as ritual spaces where priests mediate between earth and sky. The Maya did not learn this from Egypt. The Aztecs did not inherit it from Mesopotamia, and yet they arrive at the same geometric solution to the same theological problem: how to make the sacred mountain accessible, how to build the axis where divine and human realms intersect. So, the recurrence suggests something deeper than cultural transmission alone. It points toward a fundamental human recognition that vertical space organizes meaning, that height embodies hierarchy, that ascent transforms. And here is the delicate balance we have to keep. Because within the ancient Near East chronology and contact matter, Mesopotamia's ziggurats predate Egypt's pyramids. The symbolic vocabulary is documented in cuneiform and appears earlier. Cultural exchange is historically plausible. The argument for inheritance inside that region is strong. But the Mesoamerican example reminds us that inheritance is not the only way a symbol can appear. Sometimes a symbol emerges independently because it answers a universal question in a universal language. And the language in this case is vertical, because a pyramid does something that can be felt without translation. It makes a claim the body understands up is different from down. Height separates. Height magnifies. Height changes the relationship between a human being and the horizon between a human being and the sky. Stand before any pyramid, Giza, Saqqara, Babylon, Teotihuacan, and the message feels strangely consistent. This is important. This is sacred. This reaches towards something beyond the ordinary plane of life. And that consistency is not just cultural habit. It is intuitive recognition of a symbolic grammar that seems embedded in how humans map meaning onto space. So now we return again to the Anunnaki, because their role in this story is often misunderstood in precisely the way modern audiences want it to be misunderstood. The Anunnaki did not build pyramids. They did not descend with advanced technology. They did not engineer monuments. What the texts describe is something subtler and in a way more powerful. Cosmic administrators who organize the universe into vertical tiers, who decree fates from positions of authority, who enforce the principle that reality is structured hierarchically. And it is that principle, more than any construction technique, that makes pyramids meaningful. not blueprints, cosmological blueprints, not instructions for masonry, instructions for order. Because if the universe is a pyramid of power authority descending from the highest realm through ranks and stations, then sacred architecture that claims to mediate between realms will naturally take a pyramidal form, stepped or smooth mud brick or limestone. The essential idea is the same sacred height embodies cosmic hierarchy. This is why in Mesopotamia, ziggurats are named bonds and foundations. They are not just tall platforms, they are the hinge where heaven and earth interface. They make the cosmic hierarchy physically accessible. They allow kings and priests to climb into a space that is closer, literally closer to divine presence. And this is why in Egypt, the pyramid texts obsess over ascent. The king becomes a star. The king joins the imperishable ones. The pyramid becomes stairway ladder ramp ray underfoot. The structure is not simply a tomb, it is a vehicle for tier crossing. So the pyramid endures because it expresses in geometry something that words struggle to stabilize: the relationship between mortality and eternity, between earth and heaven, between human authority and divine order. And again, we circle back to the central question that has been guiding this entire journey. Where did the pyramid idea truly begin? Not the building, the symbol, not the shape, the meaning. And here the answer becomes layered because the story itself is layered. On one layer, the symbolic grammar of vertical sacred space appears early in Mesopotamian texts and architecture. The Anunnaki administer a tiered cosmos. Ziggurats rise as built mountains linking realms. The idea is documented, named, practiced centuries before Egypt's pyramids. On another layer, Egypt receives this grammar through regional interconnection, through shared sacred vocabulary, and speaks it in its own accent. The pyramid becomes a specifically Egyptian device: solar theology, stellar, immortality, internal passages, guiding transformation. Egypt perfects the form, intensifies its meaning, makes it monumental in stone. On yet another layer, the pyramid emerges independently elsewhere, because the underlying intuition, height, as holiness ascent, as transformation, may be universal. So the story does not collapse into one simple conclusion. It returns like a loop to the same insight from different angles. The pyramid is not merely an architectural solution. It is a human solution to a cosmic question. How do mortals approach divinity? How does authority become visible? How does order rise from chaos? And those questions are old. Older than Egypt's limestone. Older than Mesopotamia's brick. As old as the moment humans looked up and felt instinctively that the sky is not just space, it is meaning. And this is why the pyramid speaks a language older than words. It requires no translation, no historical footnote to feel its weight. It communicates immediately. Height matters, elevation transforms the vertical axis, connects separated realms. This is not learned knowledge alone. It is symbolic recognition. So when we strip away modern fantasies, aliens advance lost civilizations, technological myths, we do not lose wonder. We gain a different kind of wonder. The wonder that human beings with clay tablets and temple hymns, with bricks and ritual stairs, with limestone and star-bound spells, built monuments not only to power, but to meaning. The Anunnaki did not build pyramids. They defined the cosmology that made pyramids meaningful: vertical hierarchy, spatial theology, the recognition that reality itself is arranged in ascending tiers. Egypt inherited and perfected that logic. Mesoamerica discovered the logic independently, and countless other cultures reached toward it through towers, temples, monuments stretching upward, driven by the same instinct that moved the first Sumerian priest to stack brick into a terrace mountain. So we return one final time in this arc to the image we began with: night over Giza, stones glowing faintly as the last light fades, silence settling, and in that silence, the pyramid stops being only a tomb, only an achievement, only an Egyptian icon. It becomes humanity's diagram of existence, order rising from chaos, meaning ascending from matter, the mortal reaching toward the eternal through geometry, the universal recognition that to climb is to approach truth. And from here, the journey doesn't end. It loops back once more to the evidence itself, the tablets, the hymns, the spell columns, the names of temples and monuments. Because the deeper question is not only what do we believe, but what did they say, and why did they keep saying it the same way, again and again? If we strip everything back, strip away the modern noise, the sensational overlays, the temptation to turn ancient religion into science fiction, the story that remains is not less interesting. It is quieter. And because it is quieter, it asks us to listen longer. It asks us to return to the evidence itself, the way the ancients named things, the way they described things, the way they repeated themselves when the stakes were cosmic. Because the deepest question here isn't only what we think the pyramid means, it's what they said it meant, and why they kept saying it in the same structural way again and again, across centuries, across scripts, across cultures. So we go back once more to the clay, back to the cuneiform tablets that do not talk about aliens, back to the archives that describe gods as administrators, councils, decreers of fates, maintainers of structure, back to that word that keeps returning: structure. Not only the structure of a building, the structure of reality. In the Mesopotamian record, the cosmos is arranged. It is tiered. It is vertical. Heaven above, ruled by Anu. The middle realm, the air and the earth, under Enlil. The deep, the Abzu, under Enki. And within this arrangement, the Anunnaki function as divine administrators, judges officials, the beings who maintain order by assigning roles, by decreeing fates, by ensuring that each part of existence occupies its appointed position. This is the heart of it: fate as appointment, not random destiny. Placement, station, role. And when reality is understood as appointed roles distributed across tiers, you can feel why architecture becomes more than shelter. It becomes a diagram you can walk inside. The ziggurat appears as that diagram, not as an experiment, as an answer, as a response to a theological problem. If heaven and earth are separated realms, if authority resides above, if communion requires approach, then where exactly does contact happen? Where do the realms touch? Where does the channel open? Mesopotamian temple names answer with startling directness because they do not speak in vague metaphors. They label the structure as if labeling a tool: house of the foundation of heaven and earth, bond of heaven and earth, house where prayers rise, house of the 7 commands of heaven and earth. The phrasing matters. Foundation, bond. These are not words of decoration. They are words of function. They describe what the building does. They tell us that in Mesopotamian thought, heaven and earth are not casually related. They must be anchored. They must be bound. They must be held in position through a cosmic hinge. And the ziggurat is that hinge. So, when hymns praise the ziggurat as a lofty crown reaching heaven, grown together with the sky, they are not merely praising height. They are stating continuity. They are stating connection. They are stating that vertical space is where cosmic order becomes accessible. And then ritual practice reinforces the same grammar in lived time. The New Year festival at Babylon, described with procedural detail, stages the renewal of kingship through ascent. The king enters at dawn. He ascends. He is purified. He removes regalia. He kneels. He is struck by the priest. He confesses. And then he is restored. His kingship is renewed from above. It is an enacted loop climb upward to submit to be reauthorized and descend again as legitimate ruler. Ascent, humiliation, restoration. Ascent, humiliation, restoration. The ziggurat does not merely symbolize the cosmic hierarchy. It makes the cosmic hierarchy actionable. It turns theology into choreography. It gives the body steps to climb so the mind can believe again that authority resides above and must be approached in the correct manner. And this matters because it shows us what pyramid symbolism is at its root, not a triangle, not a shape, but an operating system of meaning. Vertical cosmology made physical. Now slowly bring Egypt back into view, because what Egypt does is not to invent vertical cosmology, but to speak it with Egyptian destinations. Egypt's pyramid texts do for the dead king what Mesopotamian temple hymns do for the god's house. They describe vertical crossing as the mechanism of transformation. A stairway is laid, a ladder reaches, a ramp exists. The king ascends, he goes up to the sky, he joins the imperishable stars. Again, the language refuses to be efficient because the function is too important. The spells repeat the upward movement in many images, the way Mesopotamian ritual repeats the loop of ascent and renewal. And here we return again to the same crucial distinction that keeps us honest: ziggurats are not tombs. Pyramids are tombs, but not tombs alone. Ziggurats serve divine descent. Pyramids serve royal ascent. Different direction, same grammar. So when we ask again, because the story demands we ask it again, where pyramid symbolism begins, we are not asking where Egypt learned to stack stone. We are asking where the idea becomes stable, that the sacred is vertical, that height is holiness, that architecture can operate as a bridge between realms. And in the documentary record, that stability appears earlier in Mesopotamia, earlier in written form, earlier in monumental form, earlier in explicit temple naming, earlier in the ritual practice that treats vertical architecture as cosmic infrastructure. So the pyramid is not an isolated Egyptian invention, in meaning even if it is an Egyptian invention in its particular form. The cuneiform record makes that difficult to deny. And notice, because this matters, the record does not need modern interpretation to be meaningful. It tells you what it thinks the structure does. It calls it a bond. It calls it a foundation. It calls it a house mountain. It describes it as reaching heaven, grown together with the sky. That is not us imposing meaning. That is meaning preserved. So the story returns to its central claim with the same slow insistence we've been following all along. There is a reason ziggurats and pyramids look so similar. and it has nothing to do with aliens. The answer is hidden in ancient texts that describe gods who organized reality into vertical tiers of power. Once you see that the monuments change, they stop being isolated feats and become expressions of a shared sacred grammar, an ancient Near Eastern vocabulary of elevation, that Egypt speaks in stone after Mesopotamia speaks it in brick and clay. And the question remains because it must remain, because it is not meant to be closed too quickly. Where did the pyramid idea truly begin? Not the structure, the symbol, not the masonry, the meaning. And to sit with that question properly, we have to place the Egyptian pyramid texts beside the Mesopotamian temple language once more, not to force them into sameness, but to hear the shared rhythm beneath their differences, the way both civilizations used vertical geometry to describe how a mortal becomes more than mortal. The pyramid texts are quiet in a strange way. Not quiet in their content, they are full of movement, full of commands, full of declarations, but quiet in their intention. They were never meant to be read by crowds. They were meant to operate in sealed chambers, in darkness, in stillness. Words carved in stone for a king who could no longer answer back. And what do those words keep doing? They keep pointing upward. They keep returning to ascent. They keep circling the same claim. The pyramid is not a place where the king merely lies. It is a mechanism through which the king becomes other than he was. And the more we listen to that upward insistence, the more we begin to recognize the shared Near Eastern rhythm again, a rhythm already present in ziggurat hymns and temple names and ritual ascent. It's easy to miss this if we rush, if we treat the pyramid as an architectural endpoint and the texts as secondary decoration. But the texts do not speak like decoration. They speak like engineering manuals for the soul. Not engineering in metal and wood, engineering in sacred grammar. They call the structure a stairway, a ladder, a ramp. They say a path is laid so the king may ascend to the sky. And even when imagery changes, rays floats, smoke the direction does not change. Upward, always. Because in this worldview, the sacred realm is above. Authority is above. Stability is above. The imperishable stars are above. The king becomes what is above. And what makes this so revealing is how closely it matches the Mesopotamian logic, even when the mythology differs. Mesopotamia describes a cosmos administered by divine councils in tiers. Egypt describes a cosmos in which the king joins the stars and becomes imperishable. But both rely on the same spatial theology. The universe is arranged vertically, and transformation is achieved by crossing upward into a higher tier. So the pyramid becomes a vehicle for tier crossing. The ziggurat becomes a hinge for realm contact, different operations, same system. And that is why the script must keep returning, because the pattern is not something you prove once and discard. It is something you recognize, then re-recognize, then recognize again from another angle. Consider again how Mesopotamian temple names treat the ziggurat as a functional connector foundation of heaven and earth, bond of heaven and earth. Those phrases are not casual poetry. They claim that the structure holds the cosmos together. Now consider how Egyptian texts treat the pyramid as functional connector stairway to the sky ladder, to the heavens. Those phrases do not claim the pyramid represents ascent, they claim it enables ascent. So, Both cultures are doing the same conceptual move using vertical architecture as cosmic machinery. And we can feel why this is easy to miss in modern retellings. Modern categories want separation: religion over here, engineering over there, myth in one box, architecture in another. But for these civilizations, myth and architecture are inseparable because myth is a blueprint for how reality works, and architecture is a way to participate in that reality. The pyramid is creation logic made permanent. The ziggurat is cosmic hierarchy made climbable. And the Anunnaki, again, not as aliens, but as administrators, matter because they provide the clearest early articulation of the vertical worldview in documented form. They decree fates, meaning they assign roles. They maintain order by maintaining placement. They function within a cosmos that is explicitly tiered. So when we say the Anunnaki did not build pyramids, we mean something specific. They did not lay stone blocks. They did not engineer shafts. They did not design tomb corridors. But they did define the cosmic logic that made a pyramid meaningful, the grammar of tiered authority, the belief that height embodies hierarchy, the conviction that ascending through sacred space is ascending through the structure of reality itself. And this is why modern ancient astronaut narratives are not only unsupported by the text, they are in a way less interesting than what the texts actually say. Because what the texts say is that humans, without extraterrestrial intervention, constructed a worldview so coherent that it demanded architecture to embody it. The wonder is not that someone helped them. The wonder is that they did this themselves. They imagined the cosmos as a layered system and then built that system into their cities, their temples, their tombs, their ritual life. So we return to the historical sequence once more, not as a blunt argument, but as a slow alignment of timelines. Ziggurats appear in Mesopotamia by the late 4th millennium BC. Egypt's first pyramid appears later. Egypt perfects the form at Giza, and the symbolic language bond foundation, stairway, ascent exists in Mesopotamia's record earlier than Egypt's stone record. So the pyramid is not a sudden Egyptian idea appearing from nowhere. It is a regional grammar arriving in Egyptian form, translated, adapted, localized, intensified. Egypt does not invent the sacred mountain. Egypt turns the sacred mountain into the supreme expression of royal transformation. And this brings us back again to the scene at Giza, because the scene is not just atmosphere. It is the point where the argument becomes felt. Night falls. Tour buses leave. Silence returns. And the pyramids stop being museum objects in your mind. They stop being innovations. They become what they always were. Statements about existence, about vertical order, about the human desire to move upward out of chaos, out of mortality, out of the ordinary plane, into something stable, something authorized, something imperishable. So we are left with the same question repeated because it deserves repetition. Where did the pyramid begin? Not the building, the idea. And by now, the answer is less a single sentence than a recognition before Egypt raised its monuments. Mesopotamia had already inscribed the blueprint in clay. And in the final movement of this journey, we don't rush to wrap up. We circle the idea one last time, ziggurat and pyramid Anunnaki and pharaoh bond and stairway, until the conclusion feels less like a claim and more like something the evidence itself has been saying all along. So we arrive where we began, not at a final answer that closes the door, but at a recognition that opens it wider. There is a reason ziggurats and pyramids look so similar, and it has nothing to do with aliens. And the more we return to the sources, the names, the hymns, the spells, the repeated logic, the more that sentence stops being a provocative opener and becomes the only conclusion the evidence will allow. Because what we have traced is not a conspiracy of builders. It is a continuity of meaning, a shared sacred grammar, a way of speaking about reality that is older than Egypt's limestone and older than the tourist stories told beside it. In Mesopotamia, the oldest written religious texts describe a cosmos arranged in tiers. Authority flows downward. Holiness is positional. The gods occupy ranks, and those ranks are vertical. The Anunnaki operate as administrators within this system, decreeing fates, assigning roles, maintaining order. This is not mythology as entertainment. It is mythology as structure, and that structure demands architecture. So, humans build ziggurat-stepped terrace mountains where the land offers no mountains. They name them bonds between heaven and earth, foundations of heaven and earth, house mountains reaching heaven grown together with the sky. They do not bury their dead inside these structures. They climb them. They approach the summit. They enact communion in vertical space. And that matters because it shows us something plain, pyramid symbolism as a logic of vertical sacred space exists here, early documented, named ritualized before Egypt raises its first pyramid. Then Egypt enters the story. Egypt builds pyramids. Egypt perfects the form. Egypt transforms the structure into an unmatched expression of kingship and eternity. And yet the pyramid's meaning, the idea that a sacred mountain can be built that ascent, can be engineered, that vertical geometry can bridge realms, is not born in Egypt's isolation. It arrives as part of the wider Near Eastern conversation. Egypt speaks the grammar in its own accent. Where Mesopotamia builds mountains for gods to descend, Egypt builds mountains for kings to ascend. Where Mesopotamia's summit is a dwelling for divine presence, Egypt's interior becomes a pathway for royal transformation. Where Mesopotamia's ritual renews kingship through ascent and humiliation and restoration. Egypt's spells renew the king through ascent into the sky, into the imperishable stars. Different direction, same vertical logic, bond and stairway, foundation and ladder, house mountain and pyramid. Not identical shapes, but identical grammar. And creation myth sits beneath it all like the deepest foundation stone because both civilizations describe order emerging upward from watery chaos. The primeval mound rising from Nun. The structured cosmos separating from undifferentiated waters. Order rising. Reality becoming layered. Existence becoming vertical. So, the pyramid becomes creation reenacted. The ziggurat becomes cosmic hierarchy made climbable. And in both cases, the monument is not merely a symbol. It is a mechanism. It is cosmic infrastructure. It is sacred technology in the most literal sense, a tool for touching what is beyond ordinary reach. This is why the pyramid form feels older than any single culture. Because it is older than any single culture, not always in stone, but in the instinct behind stone. The instinct to map meaning vertically. To treat height as holiness. to feel that the sky is not only up, but above in the moral and cosmic sense. And that is why, even when pyramids appear elsewhere, without contact, the recurrence does not weaken the Near Eastern story. It strengthens the deeper human story that vertical geometry speaks to something fundamental in how humans arrange power, divinity, and transformation in space. But within the Near East, the timeline remains decisive. Ziggurats rise first. Cuneiform speaks first. The grammar is inscribed in clay first. Egypt inherits and perfects. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So we return to the central question one last time, not to solve it quickly, but to let it settle with the full weight of what we've traced. Where did the pyramid begin? Not as stone, as meaning. And the answer is not found by looking only at Egypt's monuments. It is found by recognizing that before Egypt ever raised its pyramids, Mesopotamia had already drawn the blueprint in myth, in hymn, in ritual, in the naming of sacred mountains as bonds between heaven and earth. The Anunnaki did not build pyramids. They defined the cosmic logic that made pyramids meaningful. They administered the grammar of sacred space, tiered authority, vertical order, ascent, as approach elevation as sanctity. And Egypt brilliantly, unmistakably turned that grammar into the most famous sentence ever written in stone. So when you stand at the base of the Great Pyramid at night and the desert wind replaces the noise of the day, the monument stops, feeling like an isolated marvel. It becomes part of a longer human attempt to diagram existence. Order rising from chaos, meaning ascending from matter, mortality reaching toward the imperishable. And maybe that is the final shift this story offers, not a debunking that drains wonder, but a grounding that deepens wonder. No aliens, no hidden technology, just human beings writing on clay, stacking brick carving spells into stone, trying to build a bridge to the highest place their imagination could name. If this kind of slow, reflective journey is what you want more of, you can support it in the quiet way. Subscribe if you'd like to keep traveling through long-form ideas like this. And if you're still here at the end, tell me when you picture the pyramid. Now, what do you see first? The tomb or the ladder?